Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. Continuing our discussion of various artistic mediums. We'll also be continuing with our discussion of mechanical reproduction of imagery today. So we'll be talking about photography, and we'll be talking a little bit about the evolution of photography, and then we'll be talking about some of the purposes of photography. But I do want to, give you a little bit of fair warning. We are going to see some, very historical, photographs today that some of them are somewhat disturbing. Some of them show rather graphic or brutal kinds of things. However, we do also have some that speak to, the power of the human spirit and all of these kinds of things. So we'll get into that, here in just a little bit, but we'll begin with a little bit of the evolution of photography itself. So, jumping on in. Photography itself literally means light writing, although it more accurately describes light drawing. But photography can be utilized as a practical tool for artists or as an art form in and of itself. So there's a lot of debate early on, especially about, the nature of photography in relation to the fine arts. A lot of, artists in the 19th century, when photography comes about, are very resistant to it because it kind of uproots their entire profession. Whereas other artists are very quick to embrace it because it allows them to do their reference material much quicker with much more ease than opposed to, say, spending hours on end meticulously hand drawing something. There are many artists that use photography for those reasons. And gradually over time, especially in the beginnings of the 20th century, we begin to see photography being recognized as an art form in and of itself, where today, obviously, there are people who create their artwork in the realm of photography as opposed to, say, painting or sculpture or something like that. But photography requires many compositional kinds of considerations, and so it's kind of interesting, and a lot of these things apply to other art forms, especially in the 2D realm, but things like angle, focus, the distance from the camera to the subject matter, as well as lighting, all can play really dramatic effects in how we view a photograph, how it's read by us, the overall feeling that it has, all of these kinds of things. So we have to take a lot of these things into consideration when we actually are making a photograph. Now, little on the evolution of photography. The basic concept of the camera predates photography by more than 300 years. And so that is in particular the device that we see here. And this device is what's known as a camera obscura. And so a camera obscura is the forerunner of the modern day camera. It literally means dark room. And this is where reflected sunlight passes through a small hole in the wall and projects onto the opposite wall whatever lays outside. And what's interesting about this is this technology works in the exact same way that the human eye works. So if we were to, if we were able to like cut our eye in half and actually look at what's happening inside, it would look exactly like this. And so what we see here in this diagram from the 18th century of a camera obscura is, the dark room here, and we have our small hole in the wall or aperture, and then we have our subject situated outside. Now, the sunlight radiates off of this and goes through the aperture and reflects the image onto the opposite wall. Now, in the camera obscura's case, this image is, reflected upside down, whereas in our eye, our brains, reinterpret the information right side up. So there is a little distinction there, but the basic idea on how this technology works is the exact same way our eyes work. So I find that to be kind of interesting. But here we can see an example of how that might go about. If we remember from our discussion of painting, the artist David Hockney, he actually wrote a book several years ago called Secret Knowledge. It's a really interesting book But it's all about how the old masters would use a variety of these different, early kind of projection methods to enhance the realism of their artwork. And so here we can see kind of how artists at that time would have used the camera obscura. And it's important too to note that Hockney has also included the use of a mirror here, which not only reflects the image back over to the other side, but also, depending on what type of mirror we use, can actually right the image upright as well. But if we were to look inside of the camera obscura, this is basically what it would look like. And it might be a little hard to see in this image, but we would be presented with a kind of hazy image that's projected. But what's interesting is that this image is, in living time. So anytime the person moves, the image would also move as well. But the softness of this kind of projection is, one way that we create more realistic paintings, because artists look at that and then they try to recreate that softness in the painting. So it really mimics the way our eyes see, because our eyes usually see things through selective focus. So whatever we're currently kind of focused on is going to be much more distinct and detailed than, say, objects in our peripheral view. So once again, this technology is theorized for, helping to create this jump in art and the realism within art between the medieval and the Renaissance period, when most of this technology really starts to be used much more heavily. But he also makes an interesting case in this, in that he cites the artist Caravaggio quite a bit, in that Caravaggio is not known to have ever done a single drawing in his entire life. There are no known drawings by Caravaggio. However, if we look at Caravaggio's paintings under a microscope, we will notice that along the leading edges of his figures, there tend to be these large scratches into the gesso layer of his canvas. And so Hockney theorizes that, he would use these scratches to kind of position his models if they had to move, and that he's actually painting his subject based on the actual reflection of the camera obscura that we see. And so here we can see David Hockney recreating one of Caravaggio's famous paintings, which we can see here of Baucis, that Greco-Roman god of wine and everything. But if we were to look at this painting under, a microscope or under infrared light, we would actually see these major kind of scratches along the leading edges of the forms, which would have helped the model realign himself and then, reproject the image as the artist painted it. And so, Caravaggio is definitely an influential artist, in that people see the realism that he's able to achieve in his paintings and are just mind blown. And the next thing you know, everyone is painting exactly like Caravaggio, or they're trying to emulate him in some way. So very, very influential. And it's a very interesting kind of concept and technique. Now, aside from the camera obscura, we also have a device that comes about in the 18th century and is very popular in the 19th century that's called the camera lucidia. And I've in fact seen this is starting to make a comeback now. I've seen advertisements for them online. But what's interesting about this is it kind of takes the camera obscura one step further, in that we no longer need this large dark room to act as our projection method. Instead, the camera lucidia works through this small prism attached to a rod, or an adjustable rod. And when we look through the camera lucidia, as we see here, the image of whatever is in front of it is actually reflected through the prism and reflected down onto our paper. And so as the artist, we can look through and then we can kind of trace, if you will. But it's important to note that if we were looking at an artist doing this and using this object, from the outside, such as we are in this particular image, we would not be able to see the projected image. It would look as though the artist is just drawing it. So to be able to see the projected image, we would actually have to look through that prism at a specific angle. However, so here we can kind of see a little bit about, a better diagram of how it actually works. But it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. But if we remember from our discussion of drawing, our friend Ingres was quite well known for doing this, and it really gives a very, naturalistic sense to his portraiture. He's really well known for his portraiture above all else. But he does many of these like camera lucidia drawings of people almost as a kind of tourist souvenir, on the side between major commissions. But we can really see that he's using it to, very accurately capture the likeness of these individuals' faces. And then he's also, making very quick notations for their clothing and things like that. And then many of these he would also use to, do paintings of later on. But what I find interesting about this is, once again, it allows the artist to very quickly render a subject without them having to sit there completely still for hours on end. Think about, when have you ever seen a baby sit still for anything? So in order to get like the accuracy of this child's face, so meticulous yet so simply, it's very remarkable. But once again, this device helps him do that quite a bit. It's also important to note that in the past, artists are really doing this more as a profession, more than, say, just making art for art's sake. So they're really going to use any kind of tools that will help them make the, the experience go faster or better or anything like that. So we shouldn't consider things like this to be cheating, like, oh, well, he didn't hand draw it himself by sight. It's just, once again, it's a different set of circumstances. However, photography itself becomes possible when scientists first discovered light-sensitive chemicals. So almost all photography until really probably until the late 90s, early 2000s is all going to be chemical photography. And this chemical process changes over time. It gets more refined and everything like that. But it's really this discovery which makes photography possible for the first time. So, in 1826, this individual, Joseph Niepce, creates the first photograph by fixing an image to a pewter plate. And pewter is a mixture of lead and tin, so it's an alloy of the two. However, he is using a camera that is literally no different than a camera obscura to do this. And so here we can see Joseph Niepce's actual camera that he used. And the only difference between this is that instead of being a large-scale room with a tiny aperture in it, instead we have a small box, and we also have an adjustable aperture which allows for, more or less light to come in. And so this is an important distinction there. However, this is the very first photograph that Joseph Niepce makes. And in fact, this is the very first photograph ever made in the world. And we might say, well, it doesn't really look like a photograph. And there are reasons for that. Chiefly is that this is a very early process that's not very well refined yet. And it takes many, many hours for this, light-sensitive material to expose itself to light. And so the camera that he used that we just saw a second ago was actually set on the windowsill of his studio and left to expose for over 12 hours. So I believe this actually took somewhere more like 16 to 18 hours to expose. And so once again, it's very grainy, it's very blurry and indistinct because obviously, the lighting has changed across the course of the day during this like 12 to 18 hour time span. So it's definitely not all that great, and we're very limited early on because once again, we have to be able to leave it sitting there for an extremely long period of time. However, this is the very first step in what will become photography as we know it. However, aside from that, a lot of early photographs are also going to emulate things like still life painting, such as this other photograph by Niepce that we see here, because once again, still lifes are the only things that can stay still for the hours it requires for light to burn these light-sensitive materials and affix the image. So a lot of the very earliest photographs tend to be, you know, fairly kind of boring and static like this. But over time, we gradually, you know, enhance the process. We, you know, begin to enhance the chemical formulas and everything. And slowly but surely, it gets better and better and better. So, in the 1830s, the painter Louis-Jacques Monde Bruguière perfects Niepce's process to create the first satisfactory photographic process. So, if Niepce creates the first photograph, it's Bruguière who creates the first satisfactory photograph. And what he does a few innovations. He kind of modifies the camera that Niepce uses. Once again, here we can see Bruguière's camera. It's based on the exact same principle as the camera obscura. However, this time he's also added a lens for focusing into the aperture, and he's also created a sliding box that allows us to focus as well. So these are two important you know, kind of adaptations within Bruguière's, you know, camera process. But here we can see one of the first photographs made by Bruguière, what comes to be known as a daguerreotype. And once again, early on, a lot of these photographs begin to emulate traditional things like still life painting. Bruguière himself has his, you know, beginning of his career in the world of painting. And so we can actually see still life objects from his studio being used in this case. But once again, these are the objects that can sit there still enough for hours on end to be able to be captured by a photograph. However, Bruguière also has an important distinction, and that is because he is the first person to ever capture a human being in a photograph. And so we might be, you know, you might see this image and say, well, where are the people? And that's because most of the people in this image were moving way too fast to be actually captured by the photograph. This is still a process that would require at least 10 or 15 minutes to expose. And so this would have been a busy Paris street in the middle of the day. However, the only person standing still long enough to be captured in this photo is actually this gentleman right down here who's actually having his shoe shined. And so he's the only person who stood still long enough to be captured in this. But this image was made in 1838. And once again, it has the distinction of being the very first photograph of a human being. So once again, a lot of Bruguière's innovations deal with the refinement of the camera apparatus itself, but also refining the chemical processes that make photography, you know, possible. And so, once again, what he comes up with is the daguerreotype, and this is the first satisfactory photographic process created by Bruguière. And so here we can see a breakdown of that process, and what I find interesting is that this process basically did not change until the advent of digital photography. Obviously, there's some changes here and there over time as it gets closer to you know, our contemporary time. However, the general principle of it does not change. And so what he would do, he would start off with a plate, and so this would be like a pewter plate, and then he would, you know, kind of cut it down and then cover it in this light-sensitive material. He would then affix that material to the plate, and then put the plate in the camera and expose it. And so he'd leave it alone for a while. He'd pull it out and then affix it again so that it wouldn't continue to be changed by lighting and everything like that, and which we would see here. And then we would, you know, affix that again, and then we would have our finished paint or our finished photograph at the end of that process. And so once again, this process basically didn't change until the advent of digital photography, just, you know, 20, 30 years ago, really. So very, very interesting in that regard. But what's interesting about daguerreotypes is, unlike portrait painting, which was the predominant way of representing a human being before this, it could be very expensive. Basically, only kings and nobility could have their portraits made. But daguerreotypes and Bruguière's process in general becomes very widely available. So it's very cheap, comparatively speaking, and basically any and everyone goes out and gets their daguerreotype made. And this is interesting because it's not just prominent people such as Abraham Lincoln that we see here. It's common people. And so common people have their images taken for the first time in history. And this is important because prior to this, most common people, once they died, our knowledge of them is just gone forever. We have no images of them. We probably have no written records of them. They are literally into oblivion almost. And so daguerreotypes kind of begin to even the playing field in, how we're able to remember people, how we're able to remember, the past, because once again, a photograph doesn't necessarily lie all the time, like a painting might, where an artist is going to put their own sensibilities into that painting. But once again, any and everyone goes out and has their daguerreotype made. So here we can see a young Abraham Lincoln before he becomes the president, before he grows his kind of iconic beard and everything. But we also have other prominent individuals such as Frederick Douglass here, very prominent abolitionist in the mid-19th century. He escapes slavery as a young man, goes to the North and spends the rest of his life trying to abolish slavery. Works with many prominent, political people of his time. I believe he actually met Abraham Lincoln on multiple occasions and all of these kinds of things. Very prominent individual. But we also have, other prominent celebrities such as Edgar Allan Poe, arguably the founder of the genre of horror, of horror literature and things like that. But once again, at the time, he wasn't well known. He's only well known to us now because he's become famous after his death. But during his own life, he was actually fairly obscure, So once again, this is a common person who might have otherwise faded into obscurity or even oblivion, is being remembered in this sense based on his actual image and everything like that. But likewise, once again, it's not just people who have become celebrities. It's any and everyone. I'm sure you've probably seen these daguerreotype images of Civil War soldiers and all kinds of different common people. I even like here, this particular one. We still have cat portraits and cat pictures and everything like that, even in the middle of the 19th century. So kind of funny there. However, by 1864, people like Julia Margaret Cameron, who we see here, begin to pioneer the use of things like controlled lighting. And so they begin to create much more artistic kinds of photography versus, say, our daguerreotypes, which tend to be very static, very front-facing. They're just representations of people. Julia Margaret Cameron begins to play with things like lighting and angle and other things like that to make photography much more artistic. And so here we can see an example of one. This is of Sir John Herschel, but we can see that rather than using direct lighting on him, she's using backlighting to accentuate the kind of wrinkles in his face, to create, this kind of sense of, importance within him. Once again, we can see those bags under his eyes. It really shows the kind of weight and importance this individual might carry and things like that. Likewise, she also begins to use, photography as a much more purely artistic kind of form, in that she's, not just representing people, instead she's representing people as characters. So it's starting to play into the realm of like theater and, performance and things like that. Such as here we can see Sir Henry Taylor dressed as, King David from the Bible and everything. But once again, she's using this controlled lighting that's not directed right on him, but rather is coming down on him to create this sense of, kind of a somber, kind of quality within the figure as, King David here is contemplating his rule, his reign, all that kind of stuff. But what I really find interesting about Juliet Margaret Cameron's photographs is that many of them actually look very contemporary. I think this one especially, is very modern in its appearance. This was made in 1864. However, it looks like something that you could see on Instagram right now. But what I find interesting is, once again, she's doing prominent people. This is Ellen Terry. She was a very famous stage actress at the time. But once again, this is using this kind of untraditional lighting for the time to create a much more artistic kind of feeling. It definitely highlights this idea of sorrow and grief and things like that. We can also see the use of selective focus and all of these kinds of things. So once again, people, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, begin to start to try to push photography away from its kind of novelty use and start to make it a little bit more artistic. I also like this image by her. This is what's known as suspense, but this is once again, creating that use of like selective focus and controlled lighting to create an overall more artistic kind of feeling. Once again, I feel like this one has a much more modern kind of look to it. But she also does a variety of different portraiture. This is another interesting one. This is of Alice Liddell. This is the girl that Alice in Wonderland was based on. So she's also, dealing with certain fantasy kinds of elements. Once again, getting into that realm of like performance and all of these kinds of things. However, aside from Cameron, we also have many artists that begin, to use photography for more artistic reference purposes. So in the beginning, the mechanical nature of photography made people unwilling to embrace it as an art form in and of itself. Because once again, it's like, well, it doesn't take any skill to do that. You just click a button or just leave this thing out to expose, yada, yada, yada. However, many artists such as Thomas Eakins, famous early American artist, begin to embrace photography for use as reference material for their paintings so that they don't have to spend hours and hours meticulously drawing and all of these kinds of things. So here we can see one photograph that he used. It's one of about 10 or 15 photographs that he took that he used as reference for his painting, The Swimming Hole. And so if we actually look at the painting of The Swimming Hole, this particular image doesn't really reference a lot of the figures in it. Some of the other ones do, but we can see that that main kind of landscape element is being utilized in it. And if we looked at some of the other photographic references he made for this, we could pick out a few of those other figures as well. But once again, he's embracing new technologies, to make his life and his job much easier for him. So that's, once again, kind of an interesting aspect. Now, aside from that, we also have artists and photographers such as Alfred Stieglitz here, who begin to promote the idea of what comes to be known as straight photography. And that is when we don't try to manipulate the lighting in the scene, such as Juliet Margaret Cameron is doing. Instead, he's relying on natural lighting, and he's literally an advocate for basically pointing the camera and shooting a shot, shooting a picture. So that this comes to be known as straight photography. But he's also one of the other prominent individuals that advocates for photography being an art form in and of itself. He's very active between the late 19th, early 20th centuries. He was also married to the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, for a period of time and everything like that. But if we look at some of his photographs, so here we can see Night Reflections. This is a photograph taken in 1897 in New York City, but he literally was just walking around and he took his camera and he took a picture. But once again, he's interested in these fleeting moments of light that are not always perceptible. So what we can see here is the kind of gas street lighting and reflecting in that kind of wet surface just after some rain and things like that. So once again, it's an interesting take in that we have a time and place that is, kind of foreign to us now, but he's still showing us the beauty of a natural scene without manipulating it in any way. And all of his photographs are like this, and once again, they're kind of interesting in that regard. So here we can see winter Fifth Avenue. So we see the snowstorm on Fifth Avenue in New York. But once again, it's this kind of quality of photograph that not many other people are doing at this time. They're doing very rigid portraits of people in a studio. Meanwhile, Alfred Stieglitz is going out and capturing everyday phenomena that might otherwise be overlooked and things like this. But he does quite a bit of this kind of work. He travels extensively across the United States and other places. But he once again is very interested in these kinds of atmospheric like effects. A lot of his artwork and his photographs begin to take on a kind of environmental kind of feel to them as well, in my opinion, especially. I especially love this particular one. This is a Grand Central Terminal in New York in 1929. So this is a little bit more toward the end of his life, but this is an interesting photograph in that this is something that we would probably never be able to see again, like we see it here. So this is a straight photograph. He literally just pointed the camera and shot the image. However, this is a time in which, the majority of people smoked tobacco. And so Grand Central Station would have been filled with tobacco smoke at one point, which allows this light coming through the windows to reflect off of that and create these interesting kind of phenomena within the image itself. So this is something that, obviously you can't really smoke cigarettes inside anymore. So this probably would not exist, or we would not be able to see this as well today if we were to go there. So once again, it becomes environmental in some way, but it also becomes reflective of specific times and specific places and all of these kinds of things. So I've always found that to be an interesting aspect of his work as well. But once again, he does do a lot of very environmental kind of work. Once again, a lot of it is dealing with this capturing of certain light phenomenon, such as we see here with those kind of sunbeams radiating out from behind the clouds and everything like that. Now, aside from Alfred Stieglitz, we also have photographers like Ansel Adams who use their photography to really influence environmentalism and environmental issues. So he plays a major role in creating, funding for our national park system and things like that. So he travels quite extensively across large portions of the United States and photographs the kind of natural wonders within the United States. And a lot of his photographs are used to raise money for national parks, the preservation of these natural areas, and all kinds of things like that. So here we can see the Tetons and the Snake River, so out there in the western United States. But he also does a lot of work around Yosemite and Yellowstone. So here we can see the Half Dome from Yosemite, but with the moon kind of present during daytime and everything like that. But once again, he's really focused on the kind of grandiose quality of nature and everything like that. But once again, this shows that photography can be used to enact certain social issues and not just be an art form in and of itself. It can really be used to, champion certain issues. And so another photographer that uses their photography to champion social issues is a man named Lewis Hine, and he's very influential in highlighting the plight of the working poor as well as immigrants to America in the early 20th century. So he did a lot of work that was looking at the use of child labor in this country at the beginning of the 20th century, and a lot of his photographs were influential in passing legislation that outlawed child labor and things like that. Here we can see child coal miners, and there's not a kid in this group that's above the age of 8. And I don't want to be a coal miner as a grown man, let alone I can't even imagine the horror of being a coal miner as an 8-year-old child. So once again, he does a lot of this, kind of photographic work that helps to illustrate the plight and the horrible working conditions of not only, common working people, but also child laborers and stuff like that. So here we can see child laborers in a glass works. So, entrusting kids to work with molten glass and all kinds of stuff like that. But aside from that, he also documents a lot of the plight of immigrants to this country in the early 20th century. So here we can see one of his photographs from Ellis Island, but He's also really well known for going into, you know, tenement buildings in New York and documenting the plight of these people, where you might have 2 or 3 families of, you know, 8 to 15 individuals each living in a 1 or 2 room, you know, apartment or something. And so disease and, you know, all kinds of things like that are very rife in those kinds of situations. So he does a lot to, you know, help create, you know, social welfare programs and other things like that through his photography. So what we come to now is a very interesting photograph, in my opinion. It's a very dark photograph. It's a very brutal photograph. And just a little backstory. This is the very first photograph that the American public was allowed to see of slain United States servicemen in World War II. And you might ask yourself, well, why are you showing us this? But I show this for a very specific reason, because I think it really speaks to the true power of photography. And there's a quote I want to read to you guys that is in association with this photograph that really speaks to photography's power as an artistic medium, as well as its power in other regards. So if you will permit me, I would like to read this quote to you about this image. So this comes from the September 20th, 1943 issue of Life magazine. And the quote associated with it is as follows. Here lie 3 Americans. What shall we say of them? Shall we say that this is a noble sight? Shall we say that this is a fine thing, that they should give their lives for their country? Or shall we say that this is too horrible to look at? Why print this image, or why print this picture anyway, of 3 American boys dead upon an alien shore? Is it to hurt people? Is it to be morbid? Those are not the reasons. The reason is that words are never enough. The eye sees, the mind knows, the heart feels. But the words do not exist to make us see or know or feel what it is like, what actually happens. And so once again, this is not a very easy photograph to look at. It's a very dark photograph, but I think that, along with the quote associated with it, really speaks to the true power of photography as a medium of truth. And in that regard, I think that is above all else what photography is really meant to be, a medium of truth. It tells us, unlike a painting where an artist can manipulate information, it tells us what actually is, what actually happens. And so what I'd like to do is, for our next several photographs, I want to show you some of the most iconic photographs from the last century and a half or so. And once again, some of them are rather dark, like the ones that we see here. But some of them inspire a great amount of hope. Some of them show technical innovations. Some of them show social changes and social cues and other things like that. So we begin here with probably, arguably, the first iconic photograph ever taken. And this is Timothy H. O'Sullivan's The Harvest of Death at the battlefield of Gettysburg. So this is the Union dead at Gettysburg. And this is the seminal battle that turns the tide of the American Civil War in the favor of the North. And it basically spells the death knell of the Confederacy. However, this is one of the first images that people would have seen that would have shown them just how horrific warfare really is. And so, you know, the Battle of Gettysburg took place in the summer, and many of these soldiers that were slain in the battle were left there on the battlefield to rot. And so we can see that, the bloated quality in many of them. And what I find interesting about this image as well is that it's actually a staged image. So Timothy O'Sullivan actually drug many of these bodies into position to be, you know, to capture a more kind of intense photograph. So once again, this is often considered to be the first truly iconic photograph, even though it is fairly brutal. However, aside from photographs like this, We also have some that show great technological innovation. Here we can see the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17th, 1903. And this is interesting because for eons and for millennia, you know, even from the days of, you know, Neanderthal and cavemen and everything like that, human beings have looked to the sky, they've looked at birds and other animals and wondered, you know, why can't we fly? I want that ability. But it's not until the beginning of the 20th century that, you know, we make it possible for the first time. And, you know, we create this dream that humanity has had, you know, for forever. And so it's, once again, rather remarkable that we're able to achieve this, and especially in something so rudimentary as their first airplane there. However, we also have photographs that talk about specific time periods in our history and talk about specific struggles and plights that we have. So this is one of the more famous photographs to come out of the Great Depression era by Dorothea Lange, and this is a migrant mother. And so the story behind this, this is a you know, a woman who traveled to California looking for agricultural work with her family. If you've ever read any of the John Steinbeck novels like The Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men, it deals with a similar kind of situation. But what we see here is the family stopped when their car broke down, and they kind of camped out on the side of the road. And Dorothea Lange came across this mother with three small children, right after her husband had abandoned them. And so we can really see the grief and anguish in her face, you know, as she's worried about, you know, how am I going to feed my kids? Once again, this is a time period where, you know, women are not usually breadwinners in a family. So the fact that her husband just up and walked away, this is a very devastating, you know, kind of situation to be in, especially considering that they're essentially homeless and out of work and, you know, all of these kinds of things. But once again, it encapsulates a moment in our history, and it shows, you know, the kind of plight of average everyday people and everything like this. And so once again, it's kind of horrific to look at as well. But there is a bit of a nice thing that happens. She actually does, you know, make it out of this situation. She goes on to live a fairly decent life for the remainder of her life. So it's not all bad, but we see in this moment that you know, moment of like desperation in her eyes, especially there. Now, we also have other images that kick off, you know, large-scale, you know, tumultuous events, and images that live in infamy, if you will. So here we see the USS Arizona on December 7th, 1941, just after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And so this is an image that was used for great patriotic zeal in America. This one image alone caused more people to volunteer for the armed service than anything else has ever done. So this one image is responsible for more people being military veterans than any other image that has ever been, at least in this country. So quite remarkable. Once again, this is an image that people in the United States would have seen, and it instills patriotic zeal in them at the time. It instills a sense of revenge and of urgency and all of these kinds of things. And so it really spurns many people into action. So it's, you know, it's a nice example of, you know, how one single image can be monumentally powerful, in my opinion. Now, likewise, we also have images like this, which, even though it comes out of World War II, also starts to show certain social changes and in our country and society and everything like that, but also starts to show a sense of hope in some way, in my opinion. So here we see American War Worker. This is also an image that's largely associated with the whole idea of like Rosie the Riveter. Even though it's not that same propaganda poster, it's still hearkening the similar idea. But what we can see is an African-American woman as she's building, you know, fighter planes and bombers in a factory. And this is an interesting experience because during World War II, most men went overseas into the armed service. And so all of these factory jobs begin to be held by women. And it's not just, white women, it's women of color and all of these kinds of things. So for the first time, women begin to enter the workforce. For the first time, women are getting equal pay to some degree, you know, and becoming breadwinners for their family. And at the same time, we start to see many new opportunities for people of color in this country that begin to arise out of need and everything like that. But more importantly than anything along those lines, it's images like this which help to create solidarity between the American people as, a form of the war effort. So, you know, even though we might not be going overseas in the armed services in that regard, we might still be coming together for this common good within the home front to make victory possible in all of these kinds of ideas. So it's an image, in my opinion, that has much more subtle and deeper kinds of levels of meaning behind it than are immediately perceptible. Now, even though this kind of image shows a much more kind of hopeful type of situation, we also have images like this that are rather bleak. And so what we see here, this is Himmler and a Soviet POW at Minsk in Belarusia. And so for unfamiliar, Heinrich Himmler, who we see here, is was the head of the German Schutzstaffel, or the SS, and he is arguably the man responsible for the Holocaust as well as the hidden Holocaust in the Soviet Union. And this is a rather regrettable aspect of World War II, in which the Nazi regime was trying to basically eliminate Slavic peoples. And so what we see here is in the aftermath of Operation Barbarossa, or the German invasion of the Soviet Union, in which the three major German army groups enact the three largest military encirclements of all time, taking over 3 million Russian prisoners of war, all of whom were basically deliberately left out in the open to die of exposure and of starvation. And so what we see here is a very bleak image, but it's also a very rebellious image, because this man, this lone Soviet prisoner, is basically looking his own death in the face, literally and figuratively. So not only is he, this man most likely died in this camp. However, you know, he's figuratively looking at his death in the face, and that he's probably not, or probably didn't survive this situation, but he's also literally looking in the face of the man who is arbitrating his own destruction. And he's doing so defiantly. And so this is a very, very powerful image, because once again, it's basically like a giant middle finger to Nazi Germany almost. Once again, it's a little bit more of a dark image, but we also have images coming out of this conflict that inspire, you know, great amount of hope, great amount of patriotic zeal once again. Here we can see the famous image by Joe Rosenthal of the second flag raising on Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And so this is the second flag that was raised over the mountain. This was done, I believe, on the 4th day of the battle that ends up lasting for 3 months. But what's interesting, and we saw this in the Marine Corps War Memorial a few lectures ago, but at the time, even though we know who these individuals all are now, there was some hot debate over that. And in essence, just because we can't see anyone's faces in the photograph, it becomes endearing to many people because of the ambiguity. So it doesn't have to be a specific individual. It could be my brother, your father, your son, or whoever it might be, And so it inspires a lot of people. It's really used to kind of encapsulate our victory in the Second World War, specifically in the Pacific Theater. But most notably, this image, this one single image, was used to raise more money for the war effort than anything else. This one image in 1945 was used as the kind of campaign image for the 7th War Bond Drive. And in 1945, this one image raised $7 billion, which by today's standards is in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. This image probably raised more money than any other singular image ever has. So it's very, very important in that regard. But once again, it's very important in what it comes to symbolize for this country, patriotically speaking, militarily speaking, and all of this kind of stuff. Now, aside from that, we once again also have images that show a great amount of technological innovation. I really love this particular image because the humor associated with it. It's a little bit lighter note here, but here we see a boy in 1948 watching television for the very first time. And so once again, this is something that I think we take for granted today, especially considering the fact that, television is basically dying out to the online streaming services and all of that kind of stuff. But imagine, going your whole life up into that point and never seeing, television at all, and how miraculous that would have appeared at the time. Even though at this time there was 3 channels and everything like that. But I love the kind of stupor on his face in this image. Similarly, we have images such as this one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which really show, a great amount of hope, as well as a great amount of, kind of social change and a call for social change and all of these kinds of things. But what I think is the most powerful about this particular image is the gesture that he's making. And if we look at the gesture he's making, it's very similar to one that we've seen before. If we remember the image of the Augustus of Prima Porta, the statue of the Roman emperor who is holding his hand out in this gesture of dictation. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. here is making a very similar gesture of dictation. However, he's not doing it in this kind of lording type of way that Augustus is, where it's like, you will obey. Instead of having his hand downturned and pointing, he has his hand upwards, and it's also open to us. This one subtle gesture of just having his hand open and, presented towards us is a very powerful gesture, because this is a gesture of welcoming. He's basically saying, come and join me in my vision for a better future. Come and join me in my vision of a utopia. Come and join me in making the world a better place for, to try to make our country live up to what it actually is meant to represent, instead of representing all of this hypocrisy over racial injustice and all of these kinds of things. So once again, this not only encapsulates a moment within the, civil rights movement, but I believe this is one of the most powerful photographs ever taken, because of the message he's giving, but also the stance that he's giving it in. And he's saying, come and join me. Not only literally, but also, metaphorically as well. Now, once again, we also have rather regrettable images coming out of this period of time as well. That, begin to highlight, America's involvement in the world as well. So what we see here, this is a photograph by Malcolm Brown, and this is the Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc and his self-immolation in the middle of Saigon in protest of President Ngo Dinh Diem on June 10th, 1963. And what I find interesting about this image, and you might have seen this, Rage Against the Machine used it as an album cover, but this is one of the first photographs that the American public saw and then realized that the situation during the Vietnam War was not going to be as cut and dry as they thought it was going to be. So a little backstory behind this, the United States supported South Vietnam, and we propped up the South Vietnamese dictator Ngo Dinh Diem, who was very unpopular in Vietnam because he represented a very small Catholic minority which very, very ruthlessly suppressed the Buddhist majority. And so Buddhist people in Vietnam hated this man. And despite their protests, America did not let them have free elections. We installed a dictator in South Vietnam. It's the reason they didn't want to help us during that conflict. It's the reason our whole experience in that conflict basically was not good, because we meddled in affairs that we probably shouldn't have. But here we can see this really, really brutal form of protest, in that the monk here, Thich Quang Duc, sat down in the middle of Saigon Street in the middle of the day, poured gasoline on himself, and one of his attendants lit him on fire. And he did not move, he did not scream, he did not flinch. He sat there in meditation and burned alive for his beliefs and for his right to, dictate his own country's, or at least chooses his own country's, well-being and form of government and things like that. So once again, this is an image that the American populace sees, and it's kind of a oh shit moment for many people, including people in our government and in our military and all of these kinds of things. Now, similarly, coming out of the Vietnam War, we also have images like this. This is Bernie Boston's Flower Power, and this is the image that comes to be synonymous with the whole hippie and counterculture movement. And so, we have many of these large-scale, anti-war protests in which the cops would come in and they'd fire tear gas off and put these, peaceful protests down. And once again, these are protests that are fully legal under United States constitutional law, yet the powers that be don't want you to express that right. And in fact, it's not long after this that they also have, massacres like the massacre at Kent State, where the National Guard fires into students peacefully protesting and murders a few people. So it's, once again, it highlights this moment in this country where there's this really, large scale tension between the kind of past traditional way of life and this new way of life that's saying, why do we have to do all of these hateful, destructive things that you guys are all about and everything. So we have this very kind of powerful moment of protest where, this individual is sticking flowers in the end of these, semi-automatic rifles and everything like that. So it comes to be synonymous with a time and place in this country as well. Now, likewise, at the same time period, we also have, once again, another really crazy technological innovation. Here we can see Buzz Aldrin's footprint on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And so think about this. This is 63 years after the Wright brothers, 66 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. So the first human flight happens in 1903. 66 years later, a man walks on the moon. This is astronomical. This is just beyond belief. If you had gone back, a few, 200 years back in the history and told people that this would happen, they probably would have laughed at you and put you in an insane asylum. However, we have done it. And, a lot of people like to debate the fact, the moon landing was a hoax and whatnot. That's all nonsense. It definitely happened. You can look through a telescope at certain parts of the moon and still see remnants of our presence there. It happened for real. But once again, it's mind-blowing that we went from, our first human flight in basically a plywood and canvas airplane to, interplanetary travel and all of these kinds of things. Now, likewise, we also have images such as this, which are kind of haunting, in my opinion. This very famous photograph. This is taken of a young Afghan girl in the early 1980s after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And, this is highlighting the kind of war-torn quality of the people's lives who are basically torn between, the Cold War actions of America and the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 and, was there throughout the 80s. And it was kind of their version of Vietnam, but America, like Russia in Vietnam, we were funding the people, who were waging counterinsurgencies against the Soviet, army. And this is how the Mujahideen came about. the Mujahideen, after this conflict, morphed into the Taliban and basically came back to bite us in the ass a little bit later on. But once again, most of the people of Afghanistan were caught in between this conflict between these two major superpowers. And so I really feel like it's reflected in this young girl's face because, you know, she's taken her burqa down, but we see the intensity of her eyes, and her eyes are so beautiful. But we can also see the worry on her face. I mean, she's basically been living in a war zone at this point for 5 years, and she's seeing her country go from a fairly, you know, it's still a third world nation at that time, but it's starting to advance, and then it just all gets destroyed. You know, starting in 1979 all the way even into now, Afghanistan has been at constant warfare since then. So many people there have never known a time without war. In fact, they actually found a photo, refound this woman in the early 2000s when we were there, and you know, they rephotographed her, and you could see just how much 30 years of warfare had just taken its toll on her, and it's really sad. I would recommend that you look that up. It's an interesting juxtaposition. However, we also have pivotal moments that, you know, mark the end of this major political conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So we have the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9th, 1989. And this is a pivotal moment because it ends 40 years of proxy wars between America and Russia. It also ends the kind of auspice of what comes to be known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction, in which, you know, if America and the Soviet Union had gone into full-scale nuclear war against one another, we would have ended all life on this planet. So people are just, you know, beyond elated at this time, at this point, when this takes place. You know, people who have been trapped in East Berlin get to experience Western culture for the first time, and, you know, all kinds of stuff like this. So it's a very pivotal kind of moment. I like that, you know, in the crowd here, you see a lot of people that look kind of elated or overjoyed, whereas, you know, these East German soldiers all just look shocked and stunned because, once again, their reality basically just dramatically changed overnight. Similarly, we also have images such as this coming out of about the same time, this time June 5th, 1989. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, there also begins to be major protests in many other communist countries, specifically in China. And this is an interesting image because it really shows, you know, the courage of one individual against overwhelming odds. And it's really remarkable in that sense, and it's, you know, inspiring and everything. And so the backstory behind this, there was a massive student protest in Beijing, and, you know, it was, you know, several million students strong, and the Chinese government does not like to be criticized whatsoever. And so they began rolling these army tanks down the main road and dispersed most of the crowd, except for this one lone individual. And this one lone individual stood his ground in front of a column of army tanks that could have crushed him with ease. They could have rolled right over him. The Chinese government definitely is not well known for its human rights, you know, kind of position. And so it's remarkable that they didn't just outright kill this guy on the spot. But every time the tanks would try to move and go around him, he would step to the side and block them again. And it just shows an extreme level of courage, and once again, what people are willing to do when they're fed up with something. Now, what's unfortunate is no one knows who this individual is. It's most likely that he was probably executed for this not long after this. No one knows, you know, once again, who he is, or if he's even still alive. If he is, he's never come out and, you know, claimed to be the individual here. But once again, he's most likely executed for this not long after this took place. Now, getting a little bit more recent, we also have, you know, images that are very iconic, once again, for patriotic kinds of reasons. I'm sure we all are familiar with this image. This is the firefighters raising the flag right after the 9/11 attacks on New York. But once again, no matter what your stance on, that situation is. We could debate it a lot, but it still becomes, and this image in particular, becomes a rallying symbol for the American people in light of that tragedy and everything like this. And once again, this very much like that image of the USS Arizona, inspires many people to go out and join the Army and, all kinds of stuff like this. Once again, I've seen this image plastered a million different places, especially in the early 2000s, right after it came out. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing this image. Very, very popular. Now, once again, we also have images that are rather hard to look at, and I wouldn't quite say that this image is iconic yet. However, I feel like it will be in the future. And so this is from November 18th, 2011. I was dealing with a lot of those Wall Street protests about wealth inequality, and it's once again issues that we're still dealing with, but it really highlights that level of police brutality and, things like this. I mean, here we have people peacefully protesting, which is their constitutional right by law, and yet the powers that be don't want you to exercise that right. And here they are using excessive, unnecessary force to end this protest. And, once again, this we could debate this a lot. You probably don't want to hear me say anything about it. I don't have very good things to say about things like this. But once again, I feel like this will become synonymous with a certain period of this country's history in times to come and everything like that. Now, once again, as we've stated and as we've kind of seen, for the majority of its history, photography has really enjoyed this kind of unquestioning reputation as a vehicle of truth. So, most photographs, all the photographs we've seen in the last several images, those are all unmanipulated photographs. Those were literally taken in the moment of things that actually happened, and everything like that. And so, for the most part, that's been photography's major kind of reputation. But that isn't to say that photographs can't lie. And obviously nowadays we have things like Photoshop, which can really easily manipulate imagery. In fact, I see so much stuff on Facebook and online where it's, people think that it's a real image and it's very obviously Photoshopped and, all of this kind of nonsense. But photo manipulation is nothing new in its own right. This actually goes all the way back to the 19th century and the advent of photography. And so here we can see one such image from the late 19th century in which the spiritual movement, which was trying to prove, that the afterlife was real, would make these fake photographs to kind of hearken to that idea. And so they would do these double negative exposures, and so you get, this kind of ghostly image on top of another and things like that. It was also very common to do a variety of different things like this. So I like these images. They tend to take on a little bit of a humorous aspect in that, we have a guy juggling his own head and, like severing your own head and all this kind of fun stuff. But once again, we can manipulate a photograph in a dark room as opposed to, say, digitally speaking. Here we can see another one of our friend Henry de Toulouse-Lautrec, who did a few of our lithography posters from last time. But we can see him, he's, the artist painting the artist and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of these early ones from the 19th century are usually kind of fun and a little bit more lighthearted and entertaining and things like that. However, we can also have photo manipulation for political reasons as well. One particular instance of this, or an individual that used it a lot, was Joseph Stalin, the kind of dictator of Soviet Russia during the 30s through the 50s. And what's interesting is that when Joseph Stalin came to power, he was a very paranoid individual. And as people fell out of favor with him, he would have them murdered or shipped off to Siberia and put into a gulag. But he would also not only eliminate the person, he would also eliminate all traces of a person, including their records, even their photographic image. So here we can see a series of photographs in which, over time, all three of these other individuals gradually lose favor with him until we just have Stalin himself left. And this is something that he does quite a bit of. Here we can see one of the more famous examples. On the right here we can see this was Stalin's original chauffeur, and I believe he was executed because he had an affair with Stalin's daughter, and so he was removed from all official state portraits. All records of him were eliminated. He was eliminated, all kinds of stuff like that. So we can use photo manipulation for more nefarious reasons as well. But we can also use, photographic manipulation to manipulate our perception of reality and everything like that. So here is a nice example. This is Philippe Halsman's Dali Atomicus. Excuse me, Atomicus. And this is, Philippe Halsman was a surrealist photographer. And he's really well known for doing these floating pictures, but they are like actual floating pictures. And he would do this, and in this image, we might be able to see a few of the wires holding up some of the elements in here, but the photographer would basically stand there ready to shoot, and he would tell you to jump. And when he screamed jump, you jumped. And he would try to capture your image in midair. And so in this particular one, not only did Dali, jump up in the background, but someone threw a few cats and a bucket of water across the screen or the aperture there. And so kind of an interesting thing. I'm sure nothing was harmed in this, but it creates this kind of surreal image that manipulates our perception of reality as well. Here we can see another one that Philippe Halsman does with Dali. And so once again, Dali would have stood there in this pose. He would have had the woman jump, and then they threw all of these, baguettes in the air around her and everything like that. But once again, this is a straight photograph. It is a point and click. It's not manipulated with, added negatives or anything like that later on. It's just the circumstance of how we're playing with the photograph itself. Now, just to end us off on a little bit of a lighter note, I'll talk a little bit about color photography. The very first color photograph ever made utilized what's known as the three-color method, and it was made by Thomas Sutton in 1861. And this is the very first color photograph ever made, and it is of a colored ribbon. And so very basic. Once again, but it uses a process similar to photolithography to recapture a image in color. And so what he's using is what's known as the three-color method. This is the first color photographic method, and it's utilizing subtractive color, which is once again the principle by which like the computer screen here works and LED TVs and all of that. But it is a method in which black, yellow, magenta, and cyan negatives are layered to create realistic color. So this is also the process by which photolithography and other things like that work. So here we can see we have the three colors, which are then placed over our black and white negative, and it creates a full color photograph. And so many different artists utilize this, but probably the most famous person to use this was this individual. This is a Russian man named Sergei Gorsky. His name very long and hard to pronounce there. But he traveled all throughout the Russian Empire in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and he documented various forms of life throughout the Russian Empire. But what he comes up with are a lot of these really vibrant, colorful photos, and I feel like they're very interesting in painting the history, or at least painting history in a way that we don't typically think of them being. So I feel like a lot of people tend to think of the past as being black and white because the only images that we might see are black and white photographs. However, that's not the case at all. It's, once again, very vividly colored, all that kind of stuff. But he does a lot of these interesting photographs, and this is probably his most interesting one in my opinion. But this is Alim Khan, the Emir of Bukhara, and this is actually the very last living, ruling descendant of Genghis Khan. So obviously there are still descendants of Genghis Khan, but this is the last one of his descendants that was still a king in some regard. And so he was kind of in along the frontier of the Russian Empire in Central Asia there. But once again, I love it because that garment he's wearing is so vibrant and everything like this. But he travels around. He photographs a number of these kinds of subjects. Here we can see Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian author of War and Peace and other major works and stuff like that. But he also goes around and documents a lot of peasant life in the far-flung corners of Russia during this time. And so once again, he gives us an interesting glimpse into traditional folk values and stuff like that. So I love these three young girls in their really vibrant colored outfits. And once again, it's something I don't feel like a lot of people tend to think of in association with the past and everything. Even movies nowadays tend to show historical costumes as being a little bit more on the drab side and stuff like that. So aside from this, most of the other advents in color photographs are kind of related more to the development of actual color film, and then making color photographs last longer so that they don't fade over time. And this is something that's hard to do aside from these glass plate negatives and things. Go look at any old color photos of, your parents from the 80s or 90s, and I guarantee they're all going to be, faded and whatnot. But once again, it's an interesting phenomenon, everything like that. But that ends us off for photography. Ends on a little bit of a lighter note. But thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time to talk about sculpture.